Watching every Best Picture winner is a feat that not everybody can say that they've completed. I've watched them all after 2 years. I've seen all 97 films for better or worse, and now I can comfortably say that Oscar bait isn't real. After nearly 100 years of Oscar ceremonies, the taste of the Academy and the everyday viewer have radically changed, and the pageantry of this event has evolved as well. When the first Academy Awards was held on May 16, 1929, it was a private dinner held for 270 people. The tickets cost $5, 15 awards were handed out, and the ceremony lasted a shockingly brief 15 minutes after the award winners had been shared in the written press 3 months earlier. In years following this, the awards were shared with the written press at 11 p.m. following the ceremony, and after the LA Times revealed the winners of the 1940s Oscars early in the night before the ceremony, it became a tradition to maintain secrecy through sealed envelopes with the winners' names, and then they would be revealed on stage, a tradition that was foolproof until the 2017 Oscars when the La La Land and Moonlight debacle happened. And the nickname the Oscars wasn't given until the 1931 ceremony when a journalist saw the gold statues that were being handed out and said, "Hey, this looks like my Uncle Oscar," and we as the general public never saw an Oscar ceremony until 1953 when the first televised Oscars took place. And now the Oscars currently have 23 different awards each year, and soon for the 2025 season we'll have a Best Casting Award and then a Best Stunt Design Award in 2027, and has led to a total of 97 Best Picture winners, 87 of which are American, 8 are British, 1 was French, and 1 was South Korean, and the only non-English language winner. The vast majority of these films have some kind of dramatic element. 35 of them have romance, 21 of them have some kind of comedy, 7 have some kind of action, 3 are fantasy films, 3 are considered family appropriate according to Letterboxd. I think the genres are very off on here, and 1 is technically a science fiction film. And despite everyone from the biggest cinephile to your casual movie watching parents and coworkers being tuned into the Oscars and sometimes catching a few nominees here and there each year, not many people can say that they've watched every single Best Picture winner. I guess it makes me better than everyone else. Kidding, we do jokes here. I'm James, this is Movie Good or Movie Bad, and today let's talk about what it was like to watch every single Best Picture winner, talking about the films by decade, talking about why I think Oscar bait as a concept doesn't exist, but however there is a way to better predict what films are going to win the Oscars. And this is going to seem like an odd move to many. We're going to start in the present before moving our way backwards because 1, I feel like people will be much more interested in seeing the flashier, high-definition films that they're more familiar with before we get to some of the worst films I've ever seen. Not that every single Best Picture winner is bad, there's certainly snubs every single year, but now 3 of my bottom 5 films of all time were Best Picture winners in the 30s and 20s. It's also genuinely wild to be here. I started watching these movies 2.5 years ago. I thought it'd be a fun challenge to do just for myself. I thought it'd be a fun little content idea for TikTok where I've been covering these films every Friday to Sunday with a few misses here and there just because things have been busier, the actor strike went on, and now we're here. My time on the internet is much more different in the way that I talk about movies. There's many more eyes on me. And yeah, lots of people have been watching this journey and we're finally at the end. So before we get started in the 20s, if you enjoy what you're seeing here, please like, comment your favorite or least favorite Best Picture winner down below. Subscribe, hit that bell, follow me in other places. You get the gist, you get the idea. I'm not going to waste your time because this is going to be a long video. So now, let's start in the 2020s. Looking at the Best Picture winners of the 2020s so far, we can get a good idea of what shapes a Best Picture winner. Now, at least the case for any Best Picture winner in recent memory, in order to win Best Picture, you need to have an already popular film with at least some monetary backing of the public, the monetary backing of the studios to put your films out there and advertise that, hey, we're in contention, we're for Best Picture, vote for us at the end of the day, and also the backing of the increasing number of Oscars pundits that we see online, whether they're part of the most established publications, independent journalists, or TikTokers who feel confident enough to put their name out there, including myself. And with all these names out there, with the increased ability to get your thoughts out about film anywhere online, including Letterboxd, it is easy to find various people online who are tuned into all the various award shows and recognize the momentum of a film that is more likely to win Best Picture. And especially in the years of Oppenheimer and Everything Everywhere All at Once as Best Picture wins, it felt very clear who was going to win overall. You just had to pay attention to the gold Golden Globes, the BAFTAs, the SAG Awards, as well as a number of other awards. And sometimes that momentum is immediate and sometimes things take time. Oppenheimer was a clear frontrunner from the second that premiered in July 2023, and Everything Everywhere All at Once sure got a lot of attention at first, but nobody ever thought it was going to win Best Picture. It got all these nominations, but many people actually thought Banshees of Inisherin was going to win, and then 6 weeks until the Oscars, everyone said, you know what, I think the tides are turning. And it's hard to say if this change of momentum has always been present, or if it's something that's just been shaped by our time living in the age of the internet, because it feels like an Oscars race can change overnight. We saw the Oscars race where, Anora won the Palm, it was the front runner. Everybody was twiddling their thumbs, questioning what would win Best Picture, feeling like there was no front runner, especially compared to the 2 previous years of the Oscars, and then Anora won. I do think a big change in the present too is also the majority of online film viewers don't like getting it wrong with their vote at the Oscars, and with an expanded and more diverse set of voters than ever before, we can see voting blocks across the globe shift nominations as well, making films that seem, like a long shot, like I'm Still Here, all of a sudden get Best Picture nominations, which was beyond deserved. I love that movie. It's one of my favorite movies of the last decade, and it's incredible to see this happen in real time. And while I do think the term Oscar bait makes many generalizations about the types of film that win, which statistically any American drama is most likely to win, I feel during key times of history, the Best Picture winner can be tied to the cultural zeitgeist and can reflect the mindset that we're all in, or at least our thoughts about film at the time. In 2020, Nomadland won, a film that can be tied to the reflective loneliness that we all felt during the COVID-19 pandemic and the shutdown. In 2021, Coda, one of the most controversial Best Picture winners, won, reflective of our need for closeness as we reemerged as a society. In 2022, we had Everything Everywhere All at Once, the film reflective of our need to confront the most challenging parts of ourselves and find repair with others. In 2023 and 2024, I think the fear surrounding the potential collapse of the movie theater as an institution and the desire to support the clear and coherent voices within the film industry made us choose Oppenheimer, especially due to its presence as a 3-hour, R-rated, partially black and white nonlinear film made by Christopher Nolan, and a film that almost grossed $1 billion, and he's also a man who'd not been rewarded by the Academy and whose contributions to the format of IMAX in the theater clearly led voters to wanting to support him. And I feel like a similar thing could be said about Anora's win and Sean Baker, but also I feel like the industry wanted to support an independent film. I think they saw this small, spunky little movie like Anora and saw someone like Sean Baker, who'd been known for making these small, independent films, and wanted to reward that. And especially now, more than ever, a film needs to speak to the times in order to win Best Picture, and while there are few films I'm anticipating a Best Picture nomination for, I do think that winner is going to be one battle after another in 2025. I haven't seen the film as of yet, but even if this doesn't match the narrative of the average person in Hollywood, this is a time where people are calling for revolution in times that feel more and more uncertain, and I feel like the film is the artistic antidote for that. The 2020s as a whole were a solid decade so far for Best Picture winners, and I hope that continues. The Oscars of the 2010s are when I remember thinking of myself paying attention more to the award season as a whole, but it's near the tail end of the decade where I find myself becoming incredibly invested, and I think that's reflective of the type of films that won Best Picture near the end of this decade. And when we think about the end of the decade, we think about Parasite's win, The Shape of Water, Moonlight, but I think they feel like such a powerful contrast to the film that won at the beginning of the decade, The King's Speech. And forgive me for the slight detour before I really start breaking down every single film of the decade, because it's incredibly advantageous for a film to win Best Picture, because those awards translate to cold, hard cash. The King's Speech cost about $15 million to make. It was expected to gross about $30 million, a film that would have made, a very minimal profit. But once the film received 12 Oscars nominations, it was all of a sudden expected to gross $200 million. Now, knowing that the film won Best Picture, what do you think the final gross of the film would be? A whopping $427.4 million. Now let's talk about how a film transforms from being a middling success to a massive box office phenomenon and also the Best Picture winner. And to do this, we actually need to talk about the term Oscars bait and actually talk about how Oscars campaigns have changed over time. Now, The King's Speech became a target for Miramax for an Oscar because it was a period piece. You might hear the term costume drama in some literature describing this. In Hollywood's perspective, these costume dramas or period pieces are actually the films that are quote-unquote Oscar bait. By giving The King's Speech a limited theatrical window and a small amount of theaters in New York City and LA on November 26, 2010, the film was able to have an audience crafted around its potential Oscars buzz, and by the time it would have a wide release weeks later on Christmas Day, it was going to be a huge hit. We see this with many Oscars contenders now, and really many independent films throughout the year in order to build hype. Many people complained about the fact that I Saw the TV Glow wasn't playing in many movie theaters, but because it had a limited release before it started playing in more, it probably made more money than if it just opened wide in 2,000 theaters across the US. And think about it this way from a strategic standpoint. If you're releasing a movie in the fall or the winter and your cast and crew is already promoting it, why not just have them on the road a little bit longer? Why not just have them do a couple more morning talk shows or magazine interviews or little gimmick videos, and all of a sudden you exist inside the mind of the average Oscars voter. There's already been this hype, there's been this conversation. Why not give the film a Best Picture nomination? Why not actually help it win? And in the case of the modern day, you're also not just building up hype within the voters of the Academy, you're building up hype within the general public, so that way when Sally Mae is watching a movie and saying, oh my god, this is amazing, let me tell my great uncle who's an Oscars voter, all of a sudden he's got this movie inside his head, inside his mind, and he says, you know what, I'm going to vote for this. And the same thing happens with these Oscars pundits who are promoting your film, because as much as people enjoy giving interviews and enjoy being journalists, I'm not critiquing that, I have friends who do this, it's incredible work. You're also doing the work of promoting the film and building up the Oscars campaign within your own interview. Now, anybody who knows the Oscars might know this strategy being popularized with Harvey Weinstein and Miramax, specifically with Shakespeare in Love's 1998 Best Picture win, and now this is the norm for every single Oscars campaign. Whether we like it or not, you need to be doing all this work, otherwise you have no chance of winning. However, that 2-week limited theatrical window to push Oscars movies in New York and LA existed far before Harvey Weinstein. Going back to the 1978 Oscar season, we should talk about The Deer Hunter, the somber Vietnam War drama that was not screening well at all, and at 3+ hours long, there were fears about how to release the movie. And then in comes Alan Carr, a very flamboyant and openly gay man who'd be known as the first Oscars consultant. Now, Carr actually had bigger hopes for The Deer Hunter than the studio ever believed. He believed that this film could actually be a serious Oscars contender, and the way to really build up that narrative and to craft that audience was to play it on the Z Channel. This was a premium cable channel that to me feels very similar to the Criterion Channel. It ran from the 1970s to late 80s and played mostly independent and non-English films, and while releasing films on cable now would make a film eligible for the Emmys and not the Oscars, this was not the case in 1978. And in the case of releasing a film on the Z Channel, you build up a very specific audience that is viewing it through a very specific lens, recognizing that, oh, this is a lot more calm, a lot more meditative, a lot more important than we're actually giving credit, and we should view the film that way. We should view it in this highbrow way, rather than a film that was getting middling reviews when it premiered back in Detroit. And then Carr said, let's release this film for 2 weeks in New York and LA, playing in one theater apiece, building up a lot of exclusivity around getting the tickets, building up a lot of hype around this movie, and then once it got Oscars nominations, plan a big Oscars re-release because everyone wants to see a big Oscars contender, and that would lead to the film actually winning Best Picture in the end. And it's amazing how something transformed from a very uncommon strategy that was happening at the time to now being the norm when talking about Oscars contenders in independent film. However, if you do want to go back to when this first started happening, go look at the 1933 film Queen Christina. There was a strategy where LA and New York City got a release around the holidays that would lead to a wide release at the beginning of the next year, and in that case, it didn't really lead to any success, but in the case of Gone with the Wind 6 years later, it did lead to a Best Picture win. And although there's a lot of numerical evidence showing that the term Oscars bait becomes more popular in the 90s, leading to its peak in the 2010s, there are uses of it as far back as 1948 with John Ford's Ford Apache. And when looking at other examples of Oscars bait throughout time, it becomes clear that this is a pretty flimsy term. Deeply apologize for this detour, but I feel like it makes everything after this point a lot easier to understand. To go back to the idea of the types of films winning Best Picture changing rapidly in this decade, we see a film like The King's Speech win Best Picture in 2010, followed by the French near-silent film The Artist, which I personally think the former two films are fine, and then we have the Ben Affleck directed political thriller Argo, and then the powerful drama of a man escaping enslavement, 12 Years a Slave, and then the single-take drama about an actor attempting a comeback, Birdman, and then the legal drama, Spotlight. I think we can argue that anything from this 6-year block could be described by some as Oscars bait, either due to their serious subject matter, the recreation of biographical content, or due to the artistic flair of these films, which again really proves how much of a nothing term this is. But for me, the viability of what could win Best Picture changes rapidly with my #1 film of all time, Moonlight. The first explicitly queer and entirely black ensemble film to win Best Picture, it was a bold win when thinking about representation and who gets to see themselves in Oscar award-winning films. Its central a way that we don't often get to see in a Best Picture winner, and although I just made a video talking about how we should be critical of brands, it was huge that A24, an independent distributor and production company, won the Oscar. And it's immediately followed by the gothic romance film Shape of Water winning Best Picture, and while many would have preferred Call Me By Your Name or Phantom Thread or another film to win that year, I felt the same. It was huge to have a film that featured a blue amphibious creature as its love interest being taken as seriously as a genre film by the Academy, and it propelled Guillermo del Toro into being associated as an Oscars heavyweight. And then while we do have the deeply disappointing Green Book, it's immediately followed by the huge win of Parasite for Best Picture, a film that made so many Americans finally read subtitles, drew a lot of eyes towards South Korean film in a way that was so ignored previously by American audiences in really certain parts of the globe. And looking at Parasite, Shape of Water, and Moonlight, we see the Academy making bolder choices for its wins and shaping up to be another one of my favorite decades for winners. The 2020s, in my opinion, is maybe the most underrated decade for Best Picture winners. I think a lot of people view these films as being pretty widely known compared to the other winners, and I think that represents the class of films that people define as quote-unquote Oscars bait. And sure, this might make my statement seem contradictory, but I think that a lot of people now in the film community often assume that well-known means lower brow, it means of lesser quality, and that's not necessarily the case. My favorite of the decade is likely No Country for Old Men, and as a huge fan of the Coens, it's funny thinking that this might not even be my top 5 films for the directors. And this is also a notable decade in a lot of ways for some of the all-time great directors that even if they didn't win their own personal Oscar for directing, their films were finally recognized. Ridley Scott gets a win early in the decade with the MF Doom starring Gladiator. Clint Eastwood gets a win with $1 Million Baby. Danny Boyle receives a win for the, in my opinion, fairly overrated Slumdog Millionaire, but hey, he is one of the all-time greats. He was never going to win for Trainspotting or 28 Days Later, and of course, Martin Scorsese was finally recognized by the Academy for his brilliant crime epic The Departed. And even when thinking of a few of the other winners, The Hurt Locker, A Beautiful Mind, and a musical that really rocked my world watching it, Chicago, these are all mainly populist films that were fairly well known to the public. The greatest example of this was the finale to likely the greatest fantasy trilogy of all time, Return of the King, which was also a $1.1 billion grossing film that made low-budget B-movie Peter Jackson a well-known name to many, and would radically change his career trajectory. And all the films from this decade for the most part range from classics, specifically naming No Country for Old Men, Return of the King, The Departed, and Gladiator, to great, which are Chicago, A $1 Million Baby, to overrated for me, Slumdog Millionaire, also A Beautiful Mind, which is really not held up to the memory that I had of the film, or also The Hurt Locker, which while not conventional to other war films of the time, does little for me personally. And then we have the infamous Crash. Winning Best Picture over Brokeback Mountain has created a personal vendetta for me and many others when speaking about the film, but beyond that, Crash offends me in many ways. It's a film that creates a lot of melodrama over people existing as their worst racial and gender-based stereotypes. It's also a film that writer and director Paul Haggis said he made to prove liberals wrong in their belief of the fact that we lived in a post-racial society, but regardless of its intent, the film is a shallow, laughable mess. It's a stain on the decade, but as we continue through this journey, it's not that uncommon for a decade to have a dud or two. The Best Picture winners of the 90s feel very spiritually similar to the 2000s for me, but overall I feel like the 90s is a much weaker decade as a whole. The decade starts off with Dances with Wolves, which for many is an epic western that combines Kevin Costner's love and respect for indigenous people with a contradictory, weird objectification that makes many, including myself, feel deeply uncomfortable, but the film is not great for me because Kevin Costner speaks like this throughout the entire long monologue of the movie, and I think his single performance takes me so deep out of the film. I also understand anybody who is deeply uncomfortable by the personification of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, but it's fair to question that and also name that Silence of the Lambs is one of the greatest Best Picture winners of all time. I also felt like I really hated westerns for such a long time, especially due to the people who get to be heroes within those films and the undercurrents of racism, but I also feel like by watching a revisionist western or watching a western from the end of their popularity that really confronts the critiques of the genre and the focus of the weight of violence and really unpacking what the genre was, I feel like the 1992 Best Picture winner Unforgiven would make me love westerns a good bit more. I personally also understand the critiques of Schindler's List, but I also find it to be a great film. Forrest Gump is one of those movies that I appreciate as a kid, but it's also a film that is narratively messy and emotionally manipulative when the melodrama only works about half the time in the film. I just like Braveheart, but The English Patient is really a film that could not keep my attention, and maybe in my opinion is the quote-unquote definitive definitive Oscar bait film. I'm also glad to have rewatched all these films as part of this journey, because when I first saw the Titanic in college, I thought its love and romance was overblown, and when I rewatched the film this time, I found myself deeply sobbing. It's also a great reminder that despite James Cameron mostly making action blockbusters and the Titanic technically being the only disaster film to win Best Picture, he also has a deep love for romance that I feel like too many directors have lost in the present. In terms of Shakespeare in Love, yes, I recognize the controversy, yes, it's fine, and yes, Saving Private Ryan should have won like everybody has said time and time again, but maybe my most controversial take for this decade, not even acknowledging how bad of a person Kevin Spacey is, American Beauty is just fine. It's a beautifully acted film and an exploration of the discontent in the American suburb of the middle-aged, middle-class man, but I also feel like even though I really enjoy this genre so much, it's pretty empty and vapid. There are many other films I think do this much better for me than this one. Maybe the most mixed for me in terms of quality, the 1980s has an equal mixture of films that I have loved and ones that I've deeply disliked. There's also a clear trend of two different kinds of films defining the films that won Best Picture for this decade. Of the 10 winners, 5 could be characterized as biopics, which were Chariots of Fire, Gandhi, Amadeus, Out of Africa, and The Last Emperor. And 3 could be characterized as family dramas, Ordinary People, Terms of Endearment, and Rain Man, while we also had Platoon and Driving Miss Daisy rounding out the bunch. And at the beginning of the decade, we had Ordinary People's win, which I have to say RIP to Robert Redford. To transition from being an actor to a director never leads to guaranteed success, and I've seen embarrassingly few of the man's films, but Ordinary People's story of a family reeling after the loss of their son after he took his life is a film that is unbelievably human and honest at a time when I don't really think people want to make many films like it. Amadeus is easily the highest quality film of the decade, but I think Ordinary People is my favorite. Chariots of Fire is much more contemporarily known as Joe Biden's favorite film, and many of you may remember the film's iconic score. But for me is also a film that I think is defined and remembered largely for a couple of key moments rather than the entirety of the film. Gandhi is largely solid, but I think for me, even at its incredible length, did not capture a full and well-rounded version of who the man was. Terms of Endearment is my second favorite of the decade, and a film that's story of a mother and daughter caused me to collapse into tears in its finale. It is a beautiful film, and I have a real soft spot for these types of pictures, even if it's not fondly as remembered as other winners. Amadeus is just so grand. I saw it for the first time in my 9th grade music class, and I think it has this deeply relatable tale about how the quest for revenge can pull us so deep out of the present that we lose ourselves. It is a remarkable film. It is as amazing as everyone said. See Amadeus if you haven't. I really dislike films like Out of Africa, even if I do love Meryl Streep and Robert Redford, and I think Platoon was a much bigger shock for me than I expected. The Last Emperor was breathtaking in scale and size, especially being filmed within the Forbidden City, but I got little else out of the film. Rain Man, I think, is a better film than most people give credit for. I understand people being upset over its portrayal of autism and how it shaped many people's thoughts about what autism was, but to me that's less of an issue about the film itself being bad representation and more of an issue with the film being the sole representation in the mainstream public for autistic people. And then we end the decade with Driving Miss Daisy, a film that I find personally aggravating for how it wants to navigate racism and prejudice, painting a blanket picture of how all prejudice is the same within a hierarchical relationship. It also draws on a lot of my issues with Green Book, which, while that is based on a real story, is also meant to make white viewers feel better about their experiences with racism and leads to a less upsetting watch, which is just unfair. And of course, it's impossible to talk about Driving Miss Daisy without talking about how it won Best Picture the same year as arguably the most important American film about race was released, and that film was not nominated for Best Picture. That movie was Do the Right Thing. God, I hate Driving Miss Daisy. Thankfully, I get to speak about the 1970s now, or easily and without a question the best decade for Best Picture winners, and also just one of the most unreal decades for nominees as well. And while The Godfather is the crowd gem of this decade, it's important to name there's a distinct shift between the Best Picture winners before The Godfather won and after The Godfather won. The grand epic was always heavily weighed by the Academy in determining its winners. You'll feel this even when you look at the winners of the 1930s, but the 1970s is also a decade decade defined by these weighty character studies and also leads to incredible Best Picture winners across the board. In 1970, we have the win of the biopic about the controversial World War II general, Patton. In 1971, we have a film spoken about primarily for its off-the-wall car chase, but is really a cat-and-mouse chase throughout the entire film that ends in such a wild and bleak way as it critiques policing the French Connection, and also won Best Picture against A Clockwork Orange and The Last Picture Show. In 1972, we have easily one of the greatest films of all time winning, The Godfather, followed by one of the greatest heist films of all time winning, and a stellar performance of Robert Redford, The Sting, which also beat American Graffiti, Cries and Whispers, and The Exorcist for Best Picture. In 1974, we have The Godfather Part 2, or the first sequel to ever win Best Picture, a film that's part sequel and part prequel, built off of the world of this classic first film, helping us understand how did Vito Corleone become the man that he was, and balance his humanity with Michael's further isolation and descent. And also, 1974 feels like such a notable year due to Francis Ford Coppola also getting a nomination for Best Picture with The Conversation, a film that he casually made in between the two Godfathers, and maybe having Gene Hackman's finest performance. 1975 might be the most competitive year that I've ever seen for a Best Picture race. In this year, the nominees were Barry Lyndon, Dog Day Afternoon, Jaws, and Nashville, and the film that won was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, an amazing, amazing movie despite your thoughts on the other films. It's a movie that absolutely ruined my day when I saw it, but I loved it. A powerful tale about finding freedom and joy and finding that place for you within the world. In 1976, we get Rocky's incredible win, and I believe off the top of my head, this is the Best Picture winner to spawn the highest numbers of sequels and spin-offs, but a film that is unquestionably great in its own right, and man, that score is just so iconic. And for as much as people understandably despise Woody Allen, it's hard to imagine the modern rom-com without Annie Hall in many ways. Bad people sometimes make really good art. It's important to confront that fact, not deny the harm and the evil that they bring into the world, but we also can't ignore some of these works and how important they are to the art form, and we also can't act like nobody made these movies. Lots of people may be mad that Annie Hall won the Oscar for Best Picture over Star Wars, but I also understand why Annie Hall won. I already spoke about the Deer Hunters win in 1978, but I do want to say this. When I saw this film, I thought it had maybe the most shallow depiction of Vietnamese people that I've seen in a prominent Vietnam War film, and I also think it did a really great job of showing who these men were and how their relationships decayed because of Vietnam. And finally, the decade ends with the divorce drama Kramer vs. Kramer, a film that was maybe groundbreaking for the time and showing what it would mean if a father was emotionally available, but regardless is a great film and a precursor to all those family dramas that I loved in the 1980s. This decade was unreal across the board, just all amazing films here, and a decade that you all should see. Another really outstanding decade for Best Picture winners was the 1960s, a decade that has a number of classic pictures for many, whether we're talking about this being a decade of prominent musical picture winners such as West Side Story, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, and Oliver, or the handful of period pieces that we saw, which technically Lawrence of Arabia is a period piece, it's a biopic, but it's much more than that, and also technically My Fair Lady and Oliver fit into this category as well, and also Tom Jones. We'll get to that later. There are also a handful of films that feel really odd to characterize in this way, but they feel very similar to social realist films that we'd see that feel so relevant to the times that they're released, that even if they don't define the types of films that won the decade, they certainly spoke to that year. I'm specifically speaking to two of the greatest films that won for this decade, Midnight Cowboy, which I think is one of the most sobering looks at the American dream I've ever seen, an essential film for any New York transplant that doesn't stoke fears about the big city versus the country, but does show us that not everything is made perfect by the big and the bold, and that we can't always escape our past. We also can't talk about the 60s and ignore Sidney Poitier's In the Heat of the Night, a film that in many ways dated, speaking on the reflections of Black people and their thoughts about policing, and at times very didactic, but also important to have been released just after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and wasn't afraid to shy away from important conversations about race in film. As for musical winners, I'd actually never seen The Sound of Music until I'd given myself this challenge, and it's just fantastic all around. Amazing music, best of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals I've seen, and Julie Andrews is an incredible actress and amazing vocalist. West Side Story is a musical I have personally had a challenging relationship with. I didn't love seeing it on Broadway as a high schooler, I didn't love the Spielberg remake years ago, but now I do find myself seeing the charm in the musical and do really think this is a film that is a brilliant adaptation of it. I personally think that My Fair Lady was a bit too long for me, and a film that I found myself wanting to enjoy more. I think that Oliver, while catchy, misses a lot of the tone tone that makes the original book so great and feels so small at times in scale. Easily my favorite film of the decade is The Apartment. If you've never seen a Billy Wilder production before, he is a master of comedy and drama and interpersonal affairs, and this film, following a clerk within an insurance company facilitating the affairs of executives in his own apartment, is just a really fantastic time. I talked about this briefly before, but I will say this, that Lawrence of Arabia is not the white savior film that many people think it is, and it's indeed an amazing film about the many ways that white people destabilize the world. It's actually quite frightening in retrospect. I really wanted to love A Man for All Seasons, a film that feels so similar to the political drama that we'd expect in Game of Thrones, but sadly missing the weight that I would expect, and also Tom Jones is awful. It's a British comedy that won Best Picture in 1963, and while many people across the pond still love it, it is one of the least funny films I've ever seen. I hated it. And for all the Best Picture winners that I've spoken about from the 2020s to the 1960s, even if there were films I disliked more, I could follow the logic of why they won Best Picture, and that feels a lot less present to me when talking about Tom Jones. So at the beginning of this video, I talked about how I was going to be covering films from the present to the past because you know what, you all are more familiar with those movies. But I want to warn you about this. During the infancy of the Academy, it was astounding what they could get away with. Some of these films are really not that remarkable. Some of my favorites are here between the 50s and the 40s, don't get me wrong, but it's a bit of a rougher journey as a whole here, so just kind of stick with it. Of the films of the 1950s, 2 of these movies are my top 10 Best Picture winners of all time. At number 6, we have All About Eve, a timeless tale about the cutthroat nature of being a woman in Hollywood and feeling like you're being pushed out by someone younger. And this really tracks considering how much I love films about celebrity and living underneath the public eye, and this is just one of the best of that subgenre. I also really loved On the Waterfront, the 1954 winner starring Marlon Brando, and just one of the greatest performances of all time as he goes against union leaders and becomes my number 9 of my favorites. This is a film with very murky and questionable politics in my opinion, but it also stresses the urgency and need for unions, even if it isn't, saying that at its surface level. There's also the incredible The Bridge on the River Kwai, which is a great World War II picture about the need to question our ideals, morals, and orders. From Here to Eternity, which is a World War II romance film that is filled with some incredible shots of yearning between a couple that shouldn't fall in love. Marty, a Palme d'Or winner, which basically follows a man who's fallen in love with a woman who many around him find to be unattractive, yet he longs for, which is a wild and absurd premise for a movie and also a classic. And we also have Ben-Hur, which gave me chills as I witnessed the overwhelming scale of this epic, and I did really enjoy An American in Paris. Gene Kelly is great, it's a fun musical, it's a great time. There are, however, 3 Best Picture winners for this decade that I found to be pretty boring. Around the World in 80 Days is a glorified series of scenes traveling around the world, but is also so vapid and casually racist in moments. Gigi, a film that despite all its pageantry has a questionable opening number endorsing preying on underage girls, and is also a film with intolerable musical numbers. And then the worst of the decade was The Greatest Show on Earth, which is just a 2.5-hour slog that is an advertisement for the Ringling Brothers Circus. Sure, there is a narrative, sure there is a romance central to the film, but it also sent me into a blind and uncontrollable rage. World War II obviously shaped the planet in ways that are unavoidable to talk about when speaking on the human race, whether we're talking about the collective loss that was felt after World War II, the evil of Nazis and their successors still existing, the Medal of Honor and Call of Duty franchises being among some of the most prominent shooters in the modern day, and really the latter as of now, but it's also shaped many of the films that would win Best Picture for the 1940s. The 1942 winner, Mrs. Miniver, a film about a housewife in rural England who was affected by World War II and was considered an instrumental piece of propaganda in getting the United States involved in the war, and mostly a fine movie, it's fine. But then we also have the following year, Casablanca, easily one of the most quotable films of all time and one of the great romance films of all time, and while in the background of the film confronts challenging and upsetting ideas about Nazis, and they're very present in this film. It's very much a World War II film, even if people ignore that as being central to its theming or its setting. My least favorite picture of the decade came out in 1944, Going My Way, a feel-good film about a pastor attempting to care for young boys looking for direction at a school, and while a bore, an understandable palate cleanser for many when thinking about the end of World War II, or really just a way to find some kind of hope before the war was over. And even after the war, in 1946, we have The Best Years of Our Lives releasing, a film that directly understood the horrors of young men returning home from war in a sincere and honest way, and in many ways, what I think is the greatest World War II film of all time. We also have the 1947 winner Gentleman's Agreement, which while dated in some ways, also speaks so directly to invisible identity and anti-Semitism following the war, as a magazine writer pretends to be Jewish in order to understand anti-Semitism. Obviously, because the Nazis were defeated doesn't mean that anti-Semitism was over. There's clear evidence evidence that anti-Semitism was very present in the United States at this time and just historically has been. It's a film that feels too surface level for me, but again feels so important as a win after World War II. And then in 1949, we have the compelling noir All the King's Men, which touches on the fears surrounding the rise of power and popular fascist figures and signals warning bells that feel timely and important whether we're looking at back then or now. It says a lot that 6 of these Best Picture winners were all shaped by World War II, and again, speaks less to the genre or the form of these films all being the same, but all speaking to what was needed at the time. As for other winners, we also have Hitchcock's Best Picture winner Rebecca, a psychosexual mystery which follows a woman as she marries a man who is still fixated on his deceased wife, which is incredible and grew for me on a rewatch. How Green Was My Valley, which was actually my first John Ford film, a film that challenges nostalgia and class struggle and the challenges of reflecting on the past honestly, which is also a film that many people believe should not have won compared to the other nominees for this year, especially Citizen Kane. This is beyond fair, yet also How Green Was My Valley was so worthy of winning Best Picture and is my favorite of the decade. We also have The Lost Weekend, a Billy Wilder film that impressed me in its honest and challenging depiction of the disease of alcoholism and how it robs many of their time and agency. And then we also have Hamlet, which is mostly just a great Shakespeare adaptation. The 1940s are quickly becoming a decade of Best Picture winners that maybe I'm reflecting on a bit more fondly than I was before, but maybe that speaks to how mixed of a bag that each decade really is. And now we're finally at the 1930s and 20s. I'm going to blend these both together just because there's 2 winners from the 20s, and 3 of these films are among the worst I've ever seen, no exaggeration. I don't know if you all know this decade is bad. This decade is just horrendous all around. If the films are not bad, they're forgettable. -2 for the 30s. It's amazing again that the Academy could move on from this point, and I don't know if you know this. Even though the history of film can be traced back to the end of the 1880s, the first feature film actually only came out in 1906. It was the story of the Kelly Gang. So the art form was in its very infancy when crafting a feature film. Most people were, making very, very small movies, and all of a sudden let's make these longer than an hour, guys. And the films that were rewarded were mostly rewarded because they were big, even if functionally they were fine. Now, the greatest of these films for me was the original adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, which touched on a lot of the anti-war sentiments and what I loved about the original novel, including the idea of older men pushing young boys into these wars without really recognizing the cost of battle. I also really loved It Happened One Night, a cute rom-com that won Best Picture in 1934, and if you're watching a rom-com that didn't borrow from Annie Hall, it borrowed from It Happened One Night in nearly every single way. I'm sorry everyone, if you hear purring at this point, my son would want some attention. I guess I do kind of like the Frank Capra film You Can't Take It With You, a kooky comedy about a couple getting together, and one of these families is just filled with some of these strangest characters you've seen at the time. The rest of the winners are just odd. The 1934 Best Picture winner, Mutiny on the Bounty, is your standard mutiny ship film that's just of large scale. I guess the Academy liked that it had a boat in it. Grand Hotel is the 1932 winner and features a cast of colorful and vibrant characters, but it felt like a largely passive watch for me. It did very little. And the 1937 winner is the first biopic to win Best Picture, The Life of Emile Zola, but it's also a fictionalized account about the titular French writer that's a story about anti-Semitism, but it's very much neutered because they couldn't use the word Jewish. It's a very odd film in context, but I think there's a lot to gain from studying it. Now we also have Gone with the Wind, which to me is not a good film. Its look at the antebellum South was of such a scale that I get why white audience members love the film, but it's also deeply sad that the NAACP spoke about the film and talked about, why this movie was deeply racist. And many people now, when they talk about the film, act like the controversy surrounding it is much more newer, much more contemporary, but it's been called racist forever. And a wild statement for me to say, putting the racism to the side, the melodramatic romance is really not all that in the film. And this fascination with scale also leads to the 1936 winner, The Great Ziegfeld, which follows a romance within a series of musical shows, and it's a bore. And I think now it's time to talk about those 3 films from the 1930s and 20s being among the worst films I've ever seen. And just to clarify, these are not just some of the worst Best Picture winners, these are the worst movies I've ever seen, period. The least worst of these 3 is Cimarron, the 1931 winner. It is a Western taking place in Oklahoma, and is the least coherent film that I've ever seen advocate for racism or manifest destiny. Thinking about race in the United States, and specifically through film, Native Americans and Indigenous people have either been historically ignored or portrayed in some of the most god-awful ways possible, and that is no different in this film. There's also the 1929 Best Picture winner, The Broadway Melody, which is the first talking picture to win Best Picture, which is a film about a love triangle and has some of the most insufferable musical numbers I've ever seen. It's just terrible. It's like these people have heard musical numbers for the first time and started clapping maniacally because they love the keys being rattled in front of them. It is awful. And now we have the bane of my existence, the 1933 Best Picture winner Cavalcade, or aka the worst movie I've ever seen. Taking place between 1899 and 1933 through two Londoners in a glorified clip show with some of the biggest events of the world taking place through their eyes, including the funniest transition to us being revealed that these two people in the film are on the Titanic and are going to die. It's like Forrest Gump if they forgot to characterize him as a human being and remember that movie theaters also just had audiences walking in and out mid-movie with thick cigarette smoke filling the auditorium and children screaming. And this is the perfect film for that audience that was too stupid to know any better, and I think they would have changed their minds if they'd seen anything remotely better, such as the 1990s film Small Soldiers, or a video of me eating out of a bag of potato chips. And to end things on a much more positive note, let's briefly talk about the first Best Picture winner, Wings, which released in 1927, the first and only silent film to ever win Best Picture, a film that, among a time when many people were making movies in less than a month, took 9 months to shoot. They were very afraid what was going to happen with this movie, and follows two young men who fall for the same girl, but then World War II happens and they become fighter pilots. It is a very enjoyable film with great action and a strong romantic thread, but everybody talks about this film because of the extended dolly shot in this cafe that is just a marvel to look at. This is incredible. I get why people talk about this. It is upsetting that, this movie was made almost 100 years ago and most other films look like garbage now. But more wildly, we need to talk about these airplane scenes in this film because training one of your stars to learn how to fly a plane, having him operate the camera, having it descend into a free fall, and then he also has to trigger a chocolate syrup blood squib in his mouth is wild. It makes Tom Cruise look like a random little boy in the street. Even if Wings isn't my favorite movie of all time, even if I don't love it as much as other people, it is a technical marvel of filmmaking that was extremely worthy of the first Best Picture win, and a fantastic film for me to end my journey on. Reaching the end of these films is actually kind of bittersweet for me. My life looked a lot more different 2.5 years ago, and I'm very grateful for all the changes that I have, and this journey was not easy, especially from the 30s to the 50s, but my God, I saw so many amazing movies, so many movies that changed my life. This was such a fun thing to do. Some of these films I changed my mind on rewatch. Some films are new favorites now, and some films I've become an informed hater on. I feel like after you've heard a description of some of these movies and what they were, you can understand why certain movies won the times that they did win, but at the same time, none of these films are all really the same. Again, American dramas overwhelmingly dominate the films that win Best Picture, but doesn't define them. Guillermo del Toro, who is known for directing the first two Hellboy movies, Pacific Rim and also Crimson Peak, was somebody who is known as a niche genre artist, and all of a sudden, he's a massive Oscars contender. He will be nominated for nearly every single movie that he makes probably for the rest of his life. Many people associate certain acclaimed directors with being these massive Oscars contenders, but the fact that Martin Scorsese only won Best Director once for The Departed and David Lynch never won says that we don't actually know what Oscar bait is, and really, Oscar bait is such a flimsy term like I said before. As the voting body becomes more diverse, whether through age, gender, race, or just even where these voters are from, we're seeing more and more shocking movies get nominated for Best Picture. We've always talked about how horrors never really had an honest chance when it's come to the Oscars, yet The Substance was just nominated for Best Picture, and this year it feels like Sinners is going to be a massive frontrunner, even though it might not win a lot. And the bigger shock at this point is if it wasn't nominated for Best Picture. This was incredible. I'm debating watching every single A24 film. I've got like 24 of those left. I'm also considered watching every single Palme d'Or winner. Some of these overlap here. I've just watched a huge number of them, and I think that could be a very rewarding journey as well. If you're interested in either of those things, if you're interested in anything at all for the future, please share down below. I'd love to hear. Next week is my birthday. I've got a video planned for that. I'm very excited, and if you enjoyed this, like it, comment, subscribe, hit that bell. My name is James, and please take care.